You are never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream. C.S. Lewis. I want you to think of a time when you had a conversation with someone, and what you were talking about made you look back on your life. Maybe it took you back a couple of years. Maybe it took you back over a decade. But you likely felt that tug in your chest, as if you were looking at the peak version of your life. Maybe it was when you came through a major life or career disappointment, that kind of loss that basically reshapes your world. Then after periods like that, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you no longer have options, to start treating your life like it's a movie where the best scenes have already happened, and where, from the outside, everything can look fine. Internally, though, something gets restricted. The future starts feeling smaller. In essence, we can stop looking forward to things the way we used to. But that's not the reality. Your story hasn't wrapped up production yet. It's not even close. The truth is, some of the most profound joy, the deepest connections, and the most exciting opportunities of your life likely haven't even introduced themselves to you yet. But let's be clear. As much as being realistic is important, and pretending that life won't hit you hard is pointless, there's a difference between becoming wiser and becoming convinced your life has already peaked. But I don't think many of us realize how much disappointment changes the way we imagine the future. Yet it's not necessarily the major disappointments. More often, it's the accumulation of the smaller ones. It's those periods in your life where you gave everything and still didn't get the outcome you thought you earned. And then after enough of those experiences, something starts happening below the surface. We learn to adapt by protecting ourselves. You'll start to lower your overall expectations. You'll stop picturing your future as getting better or improving. Things stop getting you too excited. Your imagination definitely isn't as expansive. And hope becomes something that you're careful with. Ultimately, you'll stop letting your emotions reach towards things because a part of you is trying to avoid the feeling of disappointment before it even happens. Problem is, that self-protection can slowly turn into limitation. It's not that opportunities stop being available, but your internal perspective of what your life could still become starts diminishing. Then, and probably without even noticing it, you'll fool yourself into thinking that you're now just being realistic, or that you're more mature and less emotional. But sometimes that realistic aspect that you sell to yourself is actually disappointment that never fully healed. And when that happens, we can start living below our actual capacity. However, there's a difference between accepting reality and unconsciously limiting your future to avoid being hurt again. Whereas people routinely talk about resilience like it's supposed to mean staying endlessly optimistic, no matter what happens. But most of us don't operate that way. A series of bad experiences can quickly become your identity. A difficult year becomes proof that life is declining. A career setback turns into a feeling that you're unsuccessful. And the strange part is how convincing these identity stories can feel while they're happening, especially when they're appearing to be validated. So if you feel disconnected, disappointed, or behind for long enough, eventually it stops feeling temporary, and it can begin to start feeling that it's your new normal. And under the pressure of these emotions, it's easy to assume that your life is forever messed up, that you're too late to change directions or do anything differently. Not because it's actually true, but because emotionally, you might not allow yourself to stop wanting to chase momentum. And that matters more than we realize. A lack of momentum can feel the same as a lack of potential. If your life doesn't feel exciting, it's not always growing or expanding, then it's easy to believe that your peak is behind you. In essence, our emotions can distort our perceptions, causing us to say things like, Yeah, those were the best years of my life. On the other hand, you'll conveniently forget that during those perceived best years of your life, you were anxious, overwhelmed, uncertain, and struggling. Because nostalgia is great at editing reality. It softens the hard edges and exaggerates the memories. Now, that doesn't mean that those years weren't meaningful. They probably were. But it also doesn't mean that purpose and meaning has stopped being available going forward. Whereas the most dangerous thing we can do is mistake temporary emotional exhaustion for the permanent truth of our lives, and then compounding it by becoming uncomfortable around hopeful people. At some point, optimism may stop feeling inspiring and start feeling emotionally expensive. Because believing in something again means risking another loss, another letdown, or another experience where things didn't turn out the way you thought they should. So you pull back and you put up barriers. You might stop expecting too much. Stop talking about your hopes and your dreams. Become more reserved and less emotionally invested in possibility. Then, over time, that fear and restraint can get mistaken for self-control, whereas in all reality, you'll likely just be cynical. There's a safety in becoming the person who doesn't get their hopes up anymore, because that way you can avoid vulnerability and being disappointed. But you'll also start avoiding genuine enthusiasm, curiosity, or emotional investment in your future. And I don't think many of us notice that shift when it happens, because it usually arrives gradually, through increased self-protection, one disappointment at a time. Yes, you'll still function, still work hard, and still handle your responsibilities. But internally, you can stop emotionally participating in the possibility that life could still surprise you, because the goal becomes avoiding pain instead of building meaning. However, your future may not be as finished as your disappointment convinces you it is. But when we start feeling disconnected from life, we can assume the problem is motivation. We think that we need more energy, something to make us feel switched back on again. But a lot of the time, the deeper issue is purpose. Sometimes it's just needing a reason to stay engaged with life, beyond simply our obligations. Something that pulls you forward instead of maintaining a status quo. Because we can endure difficult periods of our life when we feel connected to something meaningful. Granted, not easily or without friction, but the pressure feels different when there's still something ahead of you that feels worth investing in. Without that, life starts becoming transactional. And after a while, we don't necessarily become miserable or unhappy. Sometimes we just become emotionally flat. We stop feeling connected to progress because internally we're no longer building towards anything that feels alive to us. On the other hand, that's why many of us can feel energized later in life when we discover a new interest. Internally, something reactivates. That curiosity comes back. That sense of possibility returns. And that doesn't happen because we suddenly change. It happens because purpose reorganizes and re-energizes us. It gives the stress and tension meaning, and it reminds us that we're still participating in life instead of simply surviving, which is important because sometimes it's having that meaning that starts pulling us back towards our true self again. And one of the best advantages that each of us can develop is the ability to keep adjusting without believing adjustment means failure. Because many of us struggle with change, not because we're incapable of adapting, but because adaptation feels like admitting that the original plan didn't work. And that can hit our egos harder than we realize, especially when we're used to being competent, when we're used to our identity being about effectiveness. However, when your life moves differently than expected, it can feel personal. But you can't forget that life rarely moves in straight lines. Careers change, priorities change, interests change. Sometimes the version of yourself that got you through one period of your life isn't the version that can carry you into the next one. And that's not a weakness. It's simply reality. However, those who continue growing over long periods usually aren't the ones who avoid disruption. They're the ones who stay emotionally open and keep evolving without turning every transition into an identity crisis, which matters both professionally and personally. Now, sometimes we get trapped trying to preserve an old version of ourselves because it worked once. Meanwhile, as we're moving forward, life is going to continue to ask of something different from us, because adaptability isn't about abandoning standards. It isn't lowering expectations. It isn't becoming passive and just going with the flow. If anything, real adaptability requires awareness, humility, and honesty. It requires each of us to admit that growth sometimes means becoming unfamiliar to ourselves, at least for a little while, which can be uncomfortable. But that also means life is still expanding you. We have to remember, there's a part of growing older that doesn't get mentioned enough. It's not that opportunities disappear. It's not that our lives become less. It's that eventually you have to decide whether you're still willing to remain emotionally available to experiencing life, even if life has disappointed you on more occasions than you want to admit. But staying open, that takes effort. Now, not in a motivational speaker kind of way, but in an unyielding willingness to keep participating instead of pulling back into your turtle shell. You have to keep seeking and being open to new interests, new opportunities, and new versions of yourself without immediately dismissing them because previous experiences might not have gone as you expected. Many of us can spend years trying to protect ourselves from disappointment, while at the same time also preventing ourselves from possibility. Then eventually, we can become so focused on preserving our stability that we stop recognizing that life may still be trying to give us opportunities to grow. The objective in all this is to be more present and continuing to believe that meaning isn't reserved for one chapter of your life. Because if you think about it, all of us can identify moments in our lives that we never saw coming. Relationships you didn't expect, opportunities you couldn't have predicted, or situations you'd had never planned for yourself. Which means the future can also still surprise you. So maybe the question isn't whether your best days are behind you. Maybe the better question is whether you're leaving the room for the new best days to come visit you. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.